So, fucking gross, sorry. But the system's not designed to allow people like RFK to win. And what do I mean by that? I mean, it's so easy to say that dismissively, right? Like, oh, the system. The system's not designed that way. It sounds very immature. If you're an adult, you're probably like, okay, buddy. But it's really not designed to let people like RFK win. What is the biggest difference between people who are serious candidates and people who are not? I'll tell you, it's pretty simple. Time in front of the camera. Okay? The people who get the most amount of time in front of the camera are the people who have the best chance of winning. And what do I mean by that? I mean, RFK's been everywhere. I don't know if you guys noticed. RFK is on Tim Dillon recently. He was on Theo Vaughn. He was on Joe Rogan. He was on a zillion podcasts. Smart campaigning, by the way, putting him in front of young people. They Trellin. But he's not in front of the camera the same way Joe Biden is, or even the same way Trump is. Interesting point, Michael. I think that there's a big difference between the time in front of the camera I'm talking about and what RFK does. We might not like it, but legacy media still has a tremendous amount of power. And they still have a tremendous amount of sway over the average person. Particularly the average person over the age of 35. The average person over the age of 35 still watches the news. Maybe not as much as they used to, but like this Republican debate tonight, which is ultimately meaningless, right? If you look at this current polling now, millions of people are going to watch that shit. And if they don't watch, they're going to watch coverage of it. Like, it actually matters who's on legacy media. It actually matters what the mainstream media talks about and does. I agree with that, Monsieur. It is about avoiding the counter narratives. But, well, what's wrong with the mainstream media then? I mean, that's really an important question, because it really wasn't always like this. Okay? It really was not always like this. There was a time when legacy media and the media in general was far less biased, but maybe more important than even bias, far less hysterical and far less based on this idea of trying to keep you locked in. You know, trying to get you to watch, right? And so in order to get you to watch, they try to shock you into watching. Well, what changed? So, who here in class has ever heard of the fairness doctrine? Okay, the fairness doctrine was basically an FCC regulation. And for my non-American fans, the FCC basically is in charge of overseeing, content censorship and basically media activity in the U.S. It's a branch of the federal government. Hey, Grendel. So, the fairness doctrine was basically this rule that if you had a broadcasting license, you needed to do certain things to keep your license. One of which is you had to use your broadcasting space, right? It used to be like the waves, the airwaves on radio, but television as well. You needed to use devote a certain percentage of your time of broadcasting to talking about the issues, right? To talking about pertinent issues of public interest. Basically things that affect the public. So essentially, the news, right? News and politics. And more importantly than that, but also as an extension of that, you had to cover those issues in a non-biased way, meaning if you presented one side of the argument, you actually had to allow the other side to be represented. And you had to give both equal time. So not only was there more like a ubiquitous news coverage, like networks radio stations that were not news oriented covered the news, or at least did news updates. But there was a non-biased tone to all of this stuff. And listen, was it biased in the Marxian sense? Yeah, it was, because it's still all, you know, liberal bullshit, right? At the end of the day, it's like conservative liberal bullshit or liberal bullshit. Either way, it's all, you know, the same shit. But, you know, at the very least, it gave Americans a sense that the news was fair and balanced and reasonable. The newscasters were like the adults in the room. Okay, anyone who's older than 30 probably still remembers remnants of this, right? But emphasis on the word remnants, because the Fairness Doctrine was done away with in 1987. So the FCC chair, who was a Reagan appointee, his name escapes me at the moment, did away with the Fairness Doctrine. Okay. Do you think the publicity stunt with the auto workers is going to help him? Probably a little. I hate to say that. Right. Well, what happened after that? Okay, so now you've done away with fairness, but, you know, is that really how we ended up in this position? Well, another subsequent piece of federal legislation that really made a huge difference, and if you watch me, you've heard me talk about it before, is the 1996 Telecommunications Act. Okay, the 96 Telecom Act was passed under Bill Clinton, went through Congress, signed into law by Bill Clinton and the Clinton administration, big supporters of the Telecom Act. What did the Telecom Act do? The Telecom Act basically it's probably one of the best examples of neoliberal legislation. What is neoliberalism? It's really important because most people think neoliberalism. I was just talking to a friend the other day, and he identifies as a neoliberal, but he doesn't even really know what that means. Neoliberal does not mean a liberal who's like more annoying, you know, or a liberal who's also a neocon, or a liberal who's like somehow, you know, an SJW on steroids. No. Neoliberalism is an economic doctrine. Okay? So during the 60s and 70s, when neoclassical economics was coming back into fashion, basically economic liberalism, aka get rid of competition, get rid of regulation, neoliberalism is a policy, an economic doctrine, which seeks to establish economic liberalism, eliminating, you know, regulation and eliminating protectionism through government intervention. So it's a very curious thing. It's establishing a free market through government, direct government interference, using big government to make the market freer. It sounds contradictory, because it is. But they had this notion, basically because the economy suffered so much in the 1970s because of the Nixon shock and the oil crisis and this, that, and the other, that if they did various, and by the way, you know, into the early 80s, in case you didn't know, the economy was not in great shape either, because the Fed essentially had to raise interest rates a shitload to try and curb inflation, which of course slows the economy down. So in order to create a surge, they figured, okay, we're going to eliminate all barriers to competition. And that was the doctrine of neoliberalism. And neoliberal economic thinkers were super influential in the Reagan administration, Bush HW administration, and the Clinton administration. And also into Bush 2 and Obama. And still today. You know, it's not done away with by any means, but so the 96 Telecom Act was a law that eliminated the barriers between markets in telecommunications. So what does that mean? Basically, there used to be laws which restricted telecommunications companies from entering new markets. It was very difficult for them to do that. Well, with this 96 Telecoms Act, it eliminated all those barriers. So now companies could compete everywhere, essentially. So if you're in the radio market in New York and you want to compete in Philly, or you want to compete in Virginia, or you want to compete in California, you can spread into those markets and compete. You could buy up stations and compete directly with the local media there. And this happened, I mean, it's most obvious and evident in radio, the effect of this, because I don't know who here has ever heard of Clear Channel. It's a huge radio company. Clear Channel essentially took over radio in the United States in the 1990s. They just completely swept through and took everything over. But this also had this crazy effect in all of telecom and all of media, where about 40 years ago, there was the media market was dominated by 50 companies. 50. Okay, that was about 40 years ago. So in the early 80s, 50 companies. That's not a lot, by the way. But they dominated media. And what do I mean by media? Television and radio. By 2005, 6 companies dominate the media. Six. Turbo says now it's 3. Well, it depends how you count it. So if you mean just television, then you're correct. But if you spread telecom into television, radio, and internet, basically internet service providers, it's 6 companies. And these 6 companies literally control information. They literally control information. Like all information in the country. What do I mean? Well, we just talked about the influence of the legacy mainstream media, right? And how, even though there's so much talk these days about how they have no power in the internet, blah, 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 which is sort of understandable why people think that, because they spend so much time online. But the fact of the matter is, people on the internet are reacting to what mainstream news media does. You know, like all of your favorite content creators online, including me, we all react. We either react to what mainstream media does, or we react to someone else who's reacting to mainstream media. So these 6 companies essentially run everything. And they've consolidated the market into just a few people. Thank you, Monsieur. In the hands of a few people. And there's no more fairness doctrine. So what does that mean? That means these people, first of all, can cover the news in any way they want to cover it. There's no standards whatsoever. So you end up with the most hysterically one-sided shit you possibly can get. And by the way, both parties understand this very well. That's why they're in cahoots with these networks. Because these networks can approach politicians, these media companies can approach politicians and say, hey, I literally own 1/6 of all communication in the country. So you have an interest in doing things on my behest, and I have an interest in helping you out. You know? Quid pro quo. So what happens is you get networks, you know, you get big media companies and the networks that they own, which are entirely, it's just straight 24/7 propaganda. And some of us take it for granted, I think, that it's like that, and we've just sort of resigned ourselves to saying, you know, that's just crap, blah, blah, blah. It's not supposed to be like that. It's really not. It never was. It was never intended to be that way. The New Deal legislation wanted to regulate the radio industry in a manner that it wasn't like that, specifically. And they've done away with that completely, totally under our noses. What's crazy about the Telecom Act, guys, is that the Telecom Act was intended to increase competition, but it actually eliminated it completely because it resulted in consolidation. And this is a fundamental law of capitalism. Everybody wants to be like, as soon as you want to talk about capitalism, everybody looks at you like you're fucking, you know, like a child or whatever. Well, listen, it's a fundamental law of capitalism. I don't give a fuck If you believe me or not, this is reality. We're describing reality here. A fundamental law of capitalism. It is competition is a zero-sum game. Only one person wins in a competition. That's it. Companies fight to the death. One wins, one loses. The loser gets absorbed by the winner. Okay, I giggle to myself because I like pro wrestling, and if you don't, maybe you don't understand the comparison. But when I grew up, there were 3 big pro wrestling companies and a bunch of small ones. Now there's one. And yes, they have competition, but the competition is nowhere near, the recognition or the influence as the main one. Yes, R.I.P. Bray Wyatt. So you have consolidation. And what am I implying? Am I implying that, you need regulation to keep competition alive? Yeah, you kind of do. You need regulations in place which allow for a diverse and healthy, real free market. But the fact is, in a contradictory kind of way, free markets through competition always trend towards monopoly. And so you need to do something to prevent monopolization, because that just destroys competition. And this is something they understood at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century in America with the trusts. Railroad trusts and various oil and all these different things that were dominated by these, wealthy, historic family dynasties in America. They understood full well that monopolies are a natural tendency and that there needs to be regulation to prevent that. Now, what I'm suggesting, the line of reasoning I'm following is very much one of what a social democrat would say. A sock dem, as they're known, in the pejorative sense. And the sock dems would tell you, through enough regulation, you can prevent this from happening. And if you listen to RFK, that's exactly what he's suggesting, is to fucking regulate the market in a way that it prevents things like this, which is just another way of saying you have to keep this on life support. Now, what a communist might conclude from all of this is actually that not only is this natural tendency unavoidable, it may actually behoove us to allow it to occur and then simply nationalize all of these things. Now, with media, it's a little tricky. With media, do you want to nationalize? Thank you for the follow, Michael. Do you really want to nationalize the media and have state media? Well, that's what we have now anyway. But it might be more valuable to have a state media that is controlled, right, by the state directly, and it's at least stated outright that it's controlled by the federal government. And then to have things like the Fairness Doctrine implemented, so that it's at least balanced. Independent media is really your only chance in getting an unbiased, highly critical view of what's going on in the country anyway. So you're probably stuck relying on that. But in terms of the media consolidation, I don't know if I have a solution to this so much as I think it's important to point out to you guys that this is why the system is broken. It's all consolidated by a few people who we don't even see that they're in power. It's so funny. That's one of the things about totalitarianism that liberals don't understand, is that they also live under totalitarianism. It's just they don't know. They don't have any fucking idea who the totalitarians are. They have no idea who the dictators are. They don't see the oligarchs who run this country.